Thank you very much. Look, I'm sorry. I have a disability in speaking languages. It's taken me a very long time to learn English, and I'm now 71. I've just managed to attain a sort of level. And I suspect many of you can speak it better than I can. So let me just first of all, again, apologise for not speaking in your beautiful language. Now, it feels a little bit like a family gathering here, because I recognise so many people. And I have my closest family here because I've been in Chile, it seems like about 3 months, it's been a month, with my colleagues from the Conservation Foundation Chilco. And I'm also here with 2 colleagues from the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh. I'm actually retired from there now, but I'm a research associate. But Graham, you may have seen Graham sporting his kilt. If you engage in a conversation with him, you'll have to get Mark to do the interpretation, because I can't understand it. Because I'm from the wrong side of the border, I'm from England. And then you've got Mark, who is actually going to make a small contribution this evening. So, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very honoured for many reasons, because I have actually talked here 20 years ago, and also because the Country Club is a city of Seguros, which I will talk about later, and I'm very proud of that. So, what I would like to do is just to try and explain some of the links between your fantastic country and Scotland. And there are some intriguing links, and they go back a very long time. Now, sorry, I'm continuing talking about myself, but just to give a bit of background, I left school at a very early age. I was, I think, 16. And I didn't live in that castle, but I worked in the grounds of Windsor Great Park, of Windsor Castle, and I worked in Windsor Great Park. So I trained as a horticulturist on a course for 2 years as an apprentice. And so at 16, it was a big adventure for me to move from my home in Stratford-on-Avon to come to Windsor. So that's where I did my training. So my background is indeed horticulture. And part of my training was in a garden that belongs to Windsor, which some of you may know, called the Savile Gardens. It's a very famous garden. And it was here when I started to notice that some plants looked a bit different. And what was amazing is I didn't quite understand the context of that then. It wasn't until many, many years later that I reflected back on some of the plants that I was seeing in the Savile Garden. So this manio, which is a very big tree, which apparently was a box of seedlings in a nursery, and it allowed to grow. So that's many, many individuals that's in the main lawn of the herbaceous borders. But it's not so much that, but it's the chakiwe and a taike, which I noticed had these very strange waxy flowers, and the shape was different from any other introductions into horticulture from Europe or from North America or indeed China. And it wasn't until I started to come to Chile that I noticed why. And it's because, of course, of the hummingbird. And it's only Chilean plants in cultivation that have, a number of them have hummingbird pollinated flowers. They're hardy enough for us to grow. There's nowhere else in Latin America where we can grow a range of plants that are hummingbird pollinated. It's really only from Chile, and I shouldn't forget your neighbours, and Argentina, that have these plants that have this remarkable adaptation. And some of you who travel to the UK will sort of feel at home, because wherever you go, you'll see Chilean plants. Whether it's the Peguen, Araucaria, whether it's Michai, Berberis darwinii is probably the commonest, not just the commonest Chilean plant, the commonest garden plant in the UK. Most of them have been planted by humans, but many of them have been planted by bird dispersal. And also Mantico, which is very, very common, and we've seen obviously a lot of it just recently. So one of the things that always fascinated me was how these plants came into cultivation. And of course, it's a very long history. It goes back to the 1800s, but there is one nursery that was instrumental in introducing garden plants to the UK from around the world. And it was this remarkable nursery called James Veitch and Son, who had a nursery in Chelsea in London, and they had another nursery in southwest England. And this firm employed 27 plant collectors, young men, and sent them around the world to introduce new and exciting plants. And 4 of these people came here to Chile. And most of the garden plants that we see in cultivation today are as a result of their hard labour. They stayed here in Chile for long periods of time. One of them, William Lobb, is very, very famous and was responsible for introducing noctral. And, but there were many, many others who not attached to this company, but who had businesses here in Chile, collecting natural history objects, particularly seashells, and also seeds, and selling them back to the UK. So it's a fascinating history. Now, the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh is an unusual botanic garden in that it has 4 sites. And you can see on the map on the right-hand side that it has the main garden in the city of Edinburgh. Just south of that is a garden called Doik, which is incredibly cold. To the left of it on the west coast, you have Benmore, which is incredibly wet. It's about 3 meters of rain a year. Okay, not as wet as some parts of southern Chile. And then right down here, if I can just come here, Mi casa es aquí. This is Logan Botanic Gardens, which is subtropical. But mi casa es aquí, cerca de un pueblo llamado Castle Douglas. You see, I can speak a bit. You may have not understood it, but so that's where I live. That's where I escaped to when I retired. My wife decided I couldn't stay in Edinburgh because I'd continue working. But it hasn't really stopped me. So I live about 3 hours away from Edinburgh. But that is a beautiful garden, Logan. It's a small garden, and it has many, many Chilean plants, because it has this very favourable climate. So, I'm going to play some music. There's no dancing. And I'm just going to give you a little overview of the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh and its 4 gardens. So I hope that's put you in a bit of a Scottish mood, and as I say, it's a remarkable suite of gardens, and because there are 4 gardens in 4 different climates with 4 different soil types, it means that we can grow a larger number of plants, and we do so from about 50 countries around the world, and we grow about 1,600 species. Now, let me just introduce my 2 colleagues. We have Mark, who's just going to say a little bit to you in a minute. Mark on the left here, and Graham, who's wearing the kilt with a very strong Scottish accent, is on the right. So both Graham and Mark are essential components of a botanic garden because they are horticulturalists. That's not to say that science isn't important, but the fact is that if you can't grow plants, if we can't grow plants, we probably won't save the planet, because that information is absolutely vital of understanding how to propagate and grow plants. And one of the reasons why that has become even more important in recent years is because we have a lot of damaged habitats and they need restoring. And the only way you're going to restore them is by using nursery grown plants for that exercise. And we're going to see a very, very rare example of a reintroduction at the very end of this talk. Takes a huge number, a lot of skills, and but it's great to see those glass houses now safe. But I'll just make this point, Mark, it's probably one of the most expensive weather stations on the planet, because on the top of it is where you record sunlight hours. But the thing is, we don't have much. Sorry? 22 million pounds to do that. But we don't have a lot of sunlight, but they still record it, and they have to climb up to the top and take a reading every day? Yeah. 9 a.m. 9 a.m. Okay. So, So a couple of years ago we had a visit to Edinburgh by members of Chilco, and it was on the occasion that Monica Musalem, who's here, had received her famous Victoria Medal of Honour from the Royal Horticultural Society, and we planted a tree of Promenopitys andina in celebration, and we linked up with the International Conifer Conservation Programme, which is the programme that I launched in 1991 and managed for 30 years. And I'm really proud of the fact that Chile, through Fundación Chilco, is now adopting that model, and hence Sitios Seguros, and hence that we have this extraordinary site here at the Country Club. And it's so heartwarming to enter the grounds of this off the main road and see that there's a very prominent sign saying this is a safe site. So I'm very pleased to see that. But a lot of what I have been involved with in Edinburgh in the last 30 years was vital training of students. And I was fortunate because I was left a sum of money by a very dear friend that I invested in the city. And I used that to bring Chileans to Edinburgh to train in horticulture, to train in science. And these are just a few of those students. And what is so fantastic now is returning to Chile and see these people not working at the cash till in the supermercados, but having important jobs in horticulture, in science, some of them working in environmental ministries, and it's so nice to see that. But that cycle is a very long cycle. That's taken 30 years, and I'm so glad to be around to see the fruition of all that. And we have some very famous plants, Chilean plants in the UK, and one of the focus plants of the Conifer Conservation Programme was indeed Alerce. We used a lot of well-known sites for planting Alerce, and you will see, indeed, we have a golf club, quite a well-known golf club, Glen Eagles. Not all golf clubs we found in the UK were successful, but certainly Glen Eagles was very, very successful for Alerce and other species as well. We even went to Down House, which was the last home of Charles Darwin. And we even encouraged Charles Darwin for this photo opportunity, where we planted a tree of Alerce. We even went to Ampton Hall, where Captain Fitzroy was born, and planted a tree in that garden. So we were opportunists. We were hunting down these links with Alerce and putting material that we collected here in Chile in those sites. And it was great fun to do that. And we did some research at the very beginning of the conifer programme, because Alerce was introduced into cultivation in 1849, that long ago. And we did some molecular research and found that everybody was growing the same clone. And indeed, it was only female, because you have male and female on separate trees. So we launched this campaign to come to Chile to broaden the genetic base by going to lots of different locations to collect seed, take it back to the UK. And while we did that, we worked with Antonio Lara at the university in Valdivia, and we looked at the genetic diversity of trees in situ. And so today, instead of having one clone, we have 109 different clones in something like 56 different sites. So you see, this is spreading the risk. It's not putting all your eggs, all your trees in one basket in one botanic garden. And that is incredibly important today. So this is spreading them around the country. And they're much safer that way. We also worked on a Darwin Initiative project in Valdivia, working with young students, and we produced this book on the threatened plants of South and Central Chile. And that was a 4-year project. It was published in Spanish, it was then printed in English, and it was a great success. And a lot of those students today, thankfully, are still working in conservation and science, and indeed horticulture. But there are some problems. The problem for me and many people is this map. In that, okay, I'm sorry I've had to put your country on its side, but it's the best way to illustrate this. So the green area is what we call a biodiversity hotspot. So that's the biodiversity hotspot. The red is all the protected areas, the government protected areas. And you see the mismatch. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have national parks in the south. Yes, we should, because we have contiguous forests, fantastic temperate rainforests, and we need to keep that. We need to keep that. It's incredibly important to abate the effects of climate change. But the problem is, a lot of national parks have been assigned because they have a nice snow-capped mountain and a beautiful blue lake, and not necessarily have high levels of biodiversity. So a lot of national parks are in the Andes, and that's good, but most of the biodiversity is indeed, and most of it is indeed along this coast. That's where most of the endemics of Chile are. So you have 47% of endemism in Chile, which is the second highest level in Latin America. And it's very simple. It's because you're a biogeographic island. You are squeezed between the Pacific and the Andes. And as soon as you get that level of isolation, you tend to get high levels of endemism. So in plants, certainly, it is very, very high. And so we have to make sure that we protect more biodiversity in these areas that have high levels of biodiversity. And a lot is being done. A lot of the private protected areas are also playing a very important role in protecting that biodiversity. If I could just mention Victoria Alonso, who's sat here, who's doing an amazing job in achieving this. But there's a lot of other people who have stepped up to the mark. So, talking about endemics, it's just interesting. On average, about 10 new endemic species are discovered and described each year. A lot of these are incredibly important discoveries. They're not minor discoveries, they're major discoveries. Let me just show you one extraordinary discovery in the San Fabian Valley, which is, of course, a UNESCO biosphere reserve, which is highly threatened with the dam. But you've got botanists teaming up with mountaineers, going up into areas that were previously thought to be inaccessible, and finding remarkable discoveries like this. So this isn't just a new species, this is a whole new genus that belongs to quite a strange family. And that is about, it's just a few little populations like that in the high Andes of the San Fabian Valley, and it doesn't occur. What is remarkable is it doesn't occur in Argentina, hasn't been found in Argentina. But they've also found lots of other things. There's a plant called Berberdopsis, which was previously only known from the coast and was a climber. They've now found a little shrub of it there. And they found about 6 new species, just because of these different disciplines teaming up and going to these relatively inaccessible sites. So it's very, very exciting. So what are we? We're in April coming into May, and I, with Chilco, manage a website for endemics, and I think so far we have 7 new endemics so far, and we're not even halfway through the year. So it's going to be a bumper crop of endemics this year, and a lot of hard work in finding these endemics and describing them, and they're all described by in-country scientists, and that is very important. And we don't have to go overseas to find experts to study biodiversity in Chile. And certainly when Chilco was doing very important inventory of biodiversity in a site in southern Chile called Vodadahue, we looked at a whole range of different biodiversity, different groups, from higher plants, mammals, mosses, you name it, and all of the experts were from Chile. We don't need to go abroad for that. They're all here, including, I've just seen him, Thomas Kramer. Thomas, welcome. And that thrills me, so much. And these people, a lot of them, they need jobs. They're not in full-time jobs. And this sort of work that Chilco is doing is getting the funding, helping to provide the funding for these remarkable experts. Nicholas Simondero, amazing botanist who trained in Edinburgh. I just want to talk a little bit about this man, because I don't want Carlos Muñoz Pizarro to be forgotten. And probably a lot of you don't know him or haven't heard of him. But he's the father of a very famous botanist, Melica Muñoz. And in his lifetime, he really was at the frontier of recognizing that there were big conservation problems here in Chile. And indeed, in 1972, he went to New York to take part in a conference. And the proceedings of that conference were ironically for him called Extinction is Forever, because he died delivering his talk. But I guess that's, I better be careful what I say, but it's not a bad way to go. But he was a remarkable man. And I just want to pay tribute to him here tonight, and I have done that in previous talks. So that's Carlos Muñoz Pizarro. So let's get on to the safe sites, Sitios Seguros. It is based, as I said before, on the International Conifer Conservation Programme. And this is Drumlanrig Castle. And this is a map of all the sites that I helped to develop over a period of 30 years. So 270 sites. It was mainly conifers, but I did sneak in quite a lot of Chilean non-coniferous material. And 190 species from 68 countries. I actually visited 40 countries to do this work. And I did develop all these sites, and I did regularly visit them, and I didn't sleep for 30 years. And in my retirement, that's not really changed much. But It is a remarkable programme, I have to say. There is nothing else like it. It's the biggest example of what we call ex situ conservation programme for any given group of plants. And so Mount Stewart, this is on the Isle of Bute, was one of our first safe sites. It has about 1,000 individuals planted on this island. Josefina, in fact, you took that photograph, you've been there. A remarkable property, just extraordinary. If you go to the west coast of Scotland, please do get the ferry to the Isle of Bute and go to Mount Stewart. It is not just for the grounds, but the house is amazing. And then I mentioned Glen Eagles, the golf course at Glen Eagles. And we also worked with a lot of private properties, but we also worked with government, local councils. So this is a park on the outskirts of Edinburgh. And that was one of the last sites that I helped to develop. And of course, the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh grows an enormous amount of these plants, particularly on the west coast of Scotland. And there's Drumlanrig Castle, which is just most amazing castle. I'm not sure how livable that castle is, but that was another very, very important safe site for us. So to be able to, so when I retired at 67, I found I couldn't, I hadn't finished. I got kicked out because 67's the year you get kicked out. And I felt, I've got all these contacts in Chile, all these wonderful people like Barbara Green and Josefina and Hossa and so on. I had to carry on. I can't just give up. I can't just put my feet up and watch television for the rest of my life. So it's been great. And I didn't do it. It was their idea of developing this model based on the International Conifer Conservation Programme. And they're doing a remarkable job for very little payback, put it that way. It's because this work is so urgent, we can't just wait until the big check arrives to start it. We've got to start now. And one of the things that we tried to do is to look, because you have a wonderful seed bank in Vicuña, which is storing vast amounts of germplasm, vast amounts of species. But the problem with seed banks still is that the bigger seeded species do not store long-term in seed banks. So things like Araucaria, they won't store long-term. So although there's not exclusively focused on those, it's mainly on what we call recalcitrant species with recalcitrant seeds. So things that we've been looking at just recently in our field work, Bellota del Norte, Bellota del Sur, big seeds, they will not store. I don't think the technology's there at the moment. So we're concentrating on those. And it's working incredibly well, but extraordinary dedication, particularly from Barbara, who's incredibly modest, but she's just been amazing. So what have we got, Barbara? Our vision is 10 sites. Over what period?
We have, I think, 9 sites in 2 years.
9 sites in 2 years, right, okay. So we're ahead of the game. That's important when you do the planning to make sure you're ahead of the game. So 1,500 individuals, 25 species. So those are the aims, those are the goals. And in a variety of sites, and those sites have to have a long-term commitment. That's sometimes quite difficult to ascertain. In my 30 years of asking landowners about the future, it was difficult for them to say, yes, we're going to be here forever. But you've got to have a reasonable level of assurance that a site is going to be around for the long term. And those sites need to have some knowledge of horticulture, of how to manage those plants, And so those are the sort of questions that we have to ask. And some of the sites that we're going to develop in Chile are going to be challenging. Perhaps there's going to be a lack of water, particularly around the sort of Santiago site. So it's not easy, but we've got to do it. And all of these sites should be considered as botanic gardens. Don't think that just a major botanic garden is where you put all your plants. All of these sites should be considered as mini botanic gardens. So again, spreading the load, spreading the risk, that is so important. And duplicating material in those sites. So if one fails, you've still got material in another site. So those are the sort of sites that we are considering. And you will see that we put monasteries because we actually, with the conifer program, had a monastery in Ireland, and that was one of our best sites. The monk who looked after the plants was extraordinary. He was amazing. So we decided let's go for monasteries as well in Chile. We haven't achieved that yet, but let's have that on the list. So that's a very diverse range of possible sites. So yes, we should work with botanic gardens to help them manage their collections for conservation. So here's some of our sites. We have Concha Toro, 107 individuals. When did we start working there at Concha Toro? 2 years ago?
2 years ago.
2 years ago, okay. So that's been a very good site. And what have we got? Oh yes, embassies. Got to have the British Embassy, keep them happy. But it's a very big garden, so they can accommodate quite a few plants. So we've got 17 plants there, and we started planting there last year. There's a new British ambassador who's just taken up office, and I have met him, and he has a scientific background, so that's fantastic. He's worked in China, he's worked in conservation, so that's really encouraging. Surely you can't get more of a better safe site than an embassy. But we also work at the Italian embassy as well. And of course, you're sat in a safe site, so feel really safe. Feel great that after 100 years, you are making this amazing contribution to 57 individuals. And what have we got? Seven species. And but I'm not doing all the work. Barbara, you've just signed an agreement. Come on. But you don't have to.
Bueno, para nosotros fue súper importante presentar el sitio acá y que fue acogido inmediatamente por la gente del Country Club, del Prince of Wales Country Club. Recorrimos acá con paisajismo, que fue un trabajo en conjunto, y decidimos algunos lugares. Ustedes pueden ver que en la entrada del country hay un pequeño sitio y hay otros árboles que están distribuidos en distintas zonas, y fue importante, al igual que en todos los sitios seguros, ver dónde se ponen para que sea acorde con los jardines. Entonces es un bonito trabajo en todos los sitios seguros de paisajismo con los mandantes o dueños, en los casos que son privados, y con nosotros. Nosotros somos es una iniciativa que trabajamos acompañados con todas las personas, entonces, y que se complementa con lo que hacen los demás. Y en este caso, bueno, hay 57 individuos de 7 especies, pero no solamente hay árboles, que son los bellotos, el naranjillo, sino que también hay arbustos, como el chuve, bueno, el ingue es árbol, la patagua es árbol, el linacillo es arbusto. Entonces es interesante ver, perdón, y son todos del vivero Pumahuida, que creo que la Mónica Musalem está por ahí, y ahí está. Y ahí está Mónica, que es la que recibió el premio que Martin contó hace un rato. Y lo más importante del proyecto es que nosotros sabemos exactamente de qué poblaciones son, porque en el fondo las especies tienen un amplio rango de distribución, y una especie, así por ejemplo, un maitén que está en la quinta región es distinto, se adapta distinto a uno que uno puede encontrar en Chiloé, y nosotros tenemos que saber de dónde son para saber dónde los ponemos. Y ese es un trabajo que hacemos en conjunto con el vivero Pumahuía, especialmente para los sitios seguros de la zona central, y que queremos seguir haciendo con otros viveros. Entonces, eso es más o menos.
Thank you, Barbara. Barbara Green, 150% Chilean with a name like that. But Barbara, you should have given this talk. I feel awful now. But anyway, thank you so much, Barbara. And I'd say again, we're so grateful for what you've done.
Now, I just want to end on this. We have to understand why botanic gardens are growing plants. Now, that might appear to be a bit of a silly question, but we have to focus on that question. So they're there for scientific research. They are grown because of education. They're there because horticulturists need to experiment with propagating them so that we can use them for restoration. And that last reason is incredibly important. But actually, it is amazing that that's very rarely achieved from botanic gardens. So, the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh is 359 years old. And in that time, it's only done one restoration program, carried out one restoration program, which I did just before I retired, of a conifer to Hong Kong. But it was only one individual. We'd held it in cultivation for 40 years, and it had become extinct in one of the populations in the new territories of Hong Kong. So we used all that material to restore the population, but it was only one genetic type. But it was better than nothing. But the thing is, we'd kept that plant in cultivation alive for 40 years. And the horticulturist, a guy called Andy Ensel, had worked out how to propagate it. So we're about to do the second. And I'm really excited about this because it's going to feature this Chilean plant. And this Chilean plant is unbelievable because of its name, Valdivia, what a fantastic name, Guyana, because that's named after a French botanist, one of the most famous botanists who's worked here and lived here in Chile. But its iconic site in the Bay of Coral is in a cave. Now, it doesn't only live in a cave, it also occurs in a Lurcy forest on slopes, on rock shelving, in really dense shade. But the iconic, there's a specimen. So we always collect herbarium material to have a record of plants in the wild so that they're there forever. So that's a collection that I made in 2013, and it's deposited in one of the national herbariums here, and indeed in Edinburgh. But the problem is that this is the cave which at one time had a shrine of the Virgin Mary outside. And I always use this as an example whereby indeed religion can help conservation, because the only reason why that population wasn't interfered with was because of that status. And it's a fantastic example. And it did have an extraordinary number of individuals on the roof. Now, 2023, I was at Valdivia and I said to Josefina, you've got to see Valdivia Guyana. So we went off after the conference, we caught the ferry, we went down to the cave, and sadly there were only 20 individuals left. I was really shocked because I've been back to that site time and time again over 30 years. So something clearly went wrong in that cave, and today it's completely empty, and it doesn't have that sort of religious status. But I don't think that's totally the reason why those plants have gone. And we don't fully understand why that's happened. It could be that the shading on the front was cleared away. It could be that the hydrology has changed. But we are doing something about it because the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh grows this plant and has banked lots of seed from this site. So we're going to take advantage of this and try and do a reintroduction program. It's not going to be easy. So that is our plants. So this is again Andy Ensel, who's got incredibly green fingers. And this plant is not easy to grow. It is very vulnerable to watering regimes. But look at the corridor. It's just full of these plants. I mean, you could never use these plants to plant back into that cave because you've got to use very small plants because these have sort of grown into sort of monstrous plants. But they're great. And Mark, these are going to be planted in the palm house because we're going to have some iconic threatened species in the palm house. And this is playing a leading role. And if we're successful in this restoration program, it will add another layer of a story. So what have we done? We know how to propagate this plant. We have published all of that information. And I always said, just before I left, I said, we've done all we can with this plant. We are just waiting for the moment when we can utilize this material in case a population needs restoring. And indeed, that has happened. And we have actually a British person called Tim Brewer who's heading this program. It's going to cost about £30,000 to do this restoration. We've got about half the money already. Because it's going to be complicated. Because we think that we're going to have to look at the moss community, first of all. We're probably going to have to re-establish the moss community. And maybe you could hydro-seed the seed of Valdivia back on it, on the surface of the moss. But we've got to understand why it disappeared. And is it worthwhile trying to restore it? Because it may be impossible. So we're also looking at other populations as well. And Tim Brewer, who's an amazing guy, he works beautifully, absolutely beautifully with the local community. And they love Valdivia. They all know about the cave and the problem. And not far from the cave, he went to somebody's house and they showed him a natural population at their back garden because their garden backs onto these steep cliffs. So there's going to be a lot of ethnobotany in this research. There's been a lot of field work to understand other habitats because we've got to have a plan B. We may use this material for restoring other habitats. So this is a very, very rare example of utilising material from a botanic garden. And we've got to get the rest of the money and we've got to complete this. So it will probably take about 3 or 4 years, I guess. So finally, let's just talk about some paintings. So quite a lot of what we do with Chilco has been working with artists to produce these extraordinary books on the plants of Chile, and many of you will know them. And it's a great vehicle for explaining about biodiversity to perhaps part of the community that may not often engage in plants and conservation. But with both these books, we've tried to include really beautiful plants with extraordinary stories. And the last volume that just came out and has sold out was about the endemic plants of Mediterranean Chile. And indeed, it was about the connections between plants and animals. And that painting illustrates it beautifully. because the flower has nothing to do with the cactus. It's a parasite. But that parasite is dependent on that cactus. And that hummingbird is dependent on the parasite being there, because the parasite is dependent on the hummingbird to pollinate it. So there's a beautiful story, and we told a lot of those stories in that book. And it was fantastic to be able to engage with 10 different artists in Chile to achieve this. And Constanza Obach is here, is she? Somewhere? Who helped to coordinate all these artists. And you've got that copy there? Sorry. Yes.
Hola, yo soy Josefina Gent, directora ejecutiva de Fundación Chilco. Nosotros trabajamos en este libro probablemente unos 5 años y estamos muy felices porque, bueno, primero se hizo una edición de lujo, pero ahora estamos trabajando con Penguin Random House para hacer la segunda edición, que va a ser lanzada en mayo, así es que es una súper buena noticia. Estas son 51 especies de la zona central, es la zona con mayores niveles de amenaza probablemente y también con altos niveles de endemismo, por lo tanto son plantas muy icónicas que ustedes van a reconocer de sus jardines. Muchas de las plantas de los sitios seguros son también plantas que están ilustradas en este libro, así es que es un trabajo del que estamos muy orgullosos. Creemos que el arte también abre la puerta para acercarse al mundo de la conservación, y por eso queremos convertir esto en una serie de libros, y nuestro próximo proyecto es Plantas del Desierto Florido.
Thank you very much, Josefina, and thank you very much for all your patience in listening to me and attention. Thank you, and good evening.